In the early hours of June 9, 2002, hotel heir Ben Novak Jr. received the shock of a lifetime when he was woken up to the sounds of someone breaking into his house. What he didn't realize at the time, though, was that the home invasion had actually been orchestrated by his wife, Narcy, and the reason she had orchestrated it was because she wanted to send him a message. Don't mess around with other women and threaten to take her lavish lifestyle away, or you're going to have to face the consequences. As she would put it in her own words that night, quote, "If I can't have you, then no one can." Of course, those words turned out to be very prophetic in the end because just 7 years after that incident, not only would Ben be dead at the hands of Narcy, but his wealthy mother Bernice would be too, seemingly leaving Narcy with a clear path to inherit their combined fortunes. This is Monsters. The Novack family had been major players in the business world for a while by the time Ben Novak Jr. was born. His father had made a fortune early on when, after purchasing a number of hotels along Miami Beach, he found that it was a prime spot for soldiers being trained in the area during World War II. And as the Second World War came to a close and Miami Beach remained a popular hotspot for the rich and famous, his wealth only continued to soar. Obviously then, that combined with his natural charm and good looks meant that he had his pick of the women of the day, and he certainly took advantage of it. But when it came to settling down and getting married, the first woman who was able to capture his heart enough to do that was Bernice Stemple. Bernice Mildred Stemple had been born on December 2nd, 1921 into a pretty rich family of her own. Her father had emigrated from London earlier in his life and had since used his own business successes to become a player in the elite world of New York's Upper East Side. Any harmony in young Bernice's life would be destroyed early on when her father's womanizing led to a divorce and the family being torn apart, with Bernice and her sister Maxine being sent to live with their aunt when neither parent felt they could look after them alone. When that didn't work out, they were sent to an orphanage. Sure, the girls would eventually be adopted by a nice German family, but that didn't make things any easier for them, as being a child of divorce back then was a bigger stigma than it is today. Still, though, even if she had emotional scars as the result of her upbringing, Bernice was able to do well at school. And on account of her good looks, she was picked up by a modeling agent when she was just 10 years old, with that leading to a career that would eventually see her become quite a big name and do work for the likes of Coca-Cola and Salvador Dali. That all changed when she met Ben Novak Sr., however, as, after their torrid love affair led to a marriage in 1952, she was asked to give up her modeling career and become something of a trophy wife instead. It was something she did, but was not all too happy about. At that point, feeling like she'd lost her identity, Bernice would fall into a depression. That meant that, as her husband was building a new hotel in Miami named the Fontainebleau, which is an anglicized pronunciation of the French word, and housing it with a number of his celebrity friends like Groucho Marx, Judy Garland, and Frank Sinatra, just to name a few, she turned into a shell of the bright and bubbly woman she'd once been. With things getting even worse when her son Ben Jr. was born on January 19, 1956. You see, being a mother never came naturally to Bernice at the best of times, and that combined with her poor state of mind meant that history would repeat itself as, like with her childhood away from her birth parents, Ben, or Benji as he was known back then, would mostly be raised by nannies and German nurses. Not that Benji seemed to mind, though. He seemed happy with his lot in life because, as the heir apparent to a hotel dynasty, he was the prince of his own little world whenever he walked through the halls of the Fontainebleau. Unfortunately, one thing that lifestyle couldn't offer him was the ability to connect with other kids. Due to the gap between the way he lived and the way his schoolmates did, Benji would become increasingly isolated from people his own age while at school and would find it very difficult to make friends. His social anxiety would get so bad that, at one point, he developed a pretty bad stutter. That would only get worse when, 4 days after his 10th birthday, his parents divorced on account of Ben Sr.'s repeated infidelity. Really then, the only thing Benji could find solace in, other than being the Prince of the Fountain Blue, was his love of Batman. In particular, he was a big fan of the 1960s TV series that was airing at the time. While that would grow into a full-blown obsession as he got older, for the time being it would be merely a hobby, one he engaged in whenever he wasn't at school or being forced to overhear all the rumors about his father turning the hotel into a hangout for gangsters. Not that there wasn't truth to those rumors, of course. In fact, they were pretty accurate all around. And when newspapers started picking up on it and publishing stories about both that and the corruption that was happening at the Fountain Blue as a result, Ben Novack Sr. found his reputation taking a major hit. His image became so bad that many of his investors would begin turning their backs on him. That would lead to him starting to suffer financial difficulties. As far as his now ex-wife was concerned, however, that was his problem. For her part, she was happy to take Benji and move to Fort Lauderdale following the divorce, the very place the youngster would find a rare school friend in actor Kelsey Grammer. That said, he would still spend plenty of time with his father over in Miami Beach, and it was there that Ben Sr. began grooming his boy to take over the business one day. But that wasn't the only career path Benji was following as he turned 17. By then, he'd also taken an interest in law enforcement and had even signed up with the Fort Lauderdale Police Department Youth Auxiliary. He would still find it difficult to make nice with his colleagues there too on account of his abrasive attitude, but he was good enough at his job and powerful enough on account of his family name that he stuck around anyway. That would be where he was when he met a young showgirl named Jill Candy and got engaged to her soon thereafter. While he might have been happy living the high rollers lifestyle with Jill, what he didn't realize was that his family's fortune was dangerously close to going away. Due to his finances taking a hit, Ben Sr. had been engaging in tax fraud for the previous few years, and following an investigation by the IRS, he was being asked to pay $27 million in back taxes, all while the hotel was about to go into foreclosure. Meanwhile, as all that was happening, Bernice was living a much happier life, one that had seen her adopt a more spiritual existence as a member of the Science of Mind Church in Fort Lauderdale. By then, her days of depression were behind her, and she was instead focusing on not only her own well-being, but trying to be more present for her son as his wedding day neared. As to whether she was aware of just how domineering and controlling her son was being over his wife-to-be, well, that's unclear. But it is known she was fully supportive of him leaving behind his ambitions of joining the police force and instead going into business for himself as an organizer for Amway conventions following his father's financial collapse. Not that Ben Jr. made a large amount of money from the enterprise, at least not at first. No, he was still somewhat reliant on the money his father had squirreled away into offshore accounts in order to keep up his hedonistic lifestyle, a lifestyle which saw him continue to womanize even after his marriage to Jill took place. In another example of history repeating itself, the young man had taken to playing the role of business big shot just like his father, rubbing shoulders with his celebrity friends on a regular basis and traveling around the country for business endeavors, all while his new bride remained at home feeling very much like a doll on a shelf. Needless to say, it wasn't long before Jill decided she'd had enough and chose to divorce Ben, but that wouldn't slow him down for long as, being the playboy he was, he quickly found love again, that time with an exotic dancer named Narcy Pacheco. Narcissa Valise Pacheco was born on November 28, 1956 into a poor peasant family in Ecuador. She eventually moved to southern Florida when she was 23 in order to seek a better life for her then-husband and 2-year-old daughter May. Once that marriage ended, though, she found herself unable to raise her child alone, and that led her to sending May away to live with her uncle in Queens, while Narcy found work as an exotic dancer at the Follies International Club. But like with her future husband, Narcy would be an abrasive person to say the least, and that often made it hard for her to get along with both colleagues and customers. So it's just as well she met Ben Jr. when she did, because once he visited the club in the summer of 1984 and got a dance from her, he quickly became infatuated. That would lead to the two starting to date one another soon thereafter. Of course, once the relationship got more serious, Ben would become just as controlling as he had in his prior relationship, with him going as far as to dictate how Narcy dressed and even what breast surgery she was going to get in order to look more attractive to him. But she seemed happy to go along with that initially, as the money and influence he had access to opened up a whole new world for her. Over time, however, her frustrations would come to boil when she realized he was cheating on her with another woman, something which at one point caused her to threaten to burn his house down should he not stop the affair. That's not the only problem Ben was dealing with at that point, though, because despite finding even more success as a businessman when he started his own company, Convention Concepts Unlimited, his father's health started deteriorating rapidly. That led to him passing away on April 5, 1985 at the age of 78. Luckily for Ben Jr., though, before his father died, he named his son the head of his estate. That meant that all of his hidden assets now belonged to the young man, making him fully financially independent at last. But even if he no longer needed the work, he continued to run his convention business, if for no other reason than the sense of power being a boss gave him. For her part, meanwhile, Bernice had moved further and further away from that lifestyle and was instead using the money she got as part of her husband's will to fund her work with charitable causes like AIDS awareness. She did still want to remain a part of her son's life, though, even if she wasn't a fan of his new girlfriend. Bernice thought that Narcy was too common for her son. Despite his mother's disapproval, Ben and Narcy continued to grow closer, and in early 1991 they got married. Clearly, though, Ben's past experience with marriage had made him aware that things could always go south. That was why he had Narcy sign a prenuptial agreement before the ceremony which stated that, should they divorce within the first 10 years of their marriage, she would not be entitled to any of his money. No, despite the fact that he was now worth an estimated $32 million, she would only get... despite the fact that he was now worth an estimated $32 million, she would only get any kind of payout at all if they happened to break up after a decade. And even then, she would only receive $65,000. But she seemed happy with that, as, even if the pair did have their ups and downs, Narcy appeared to love Ben, and she clearly loved the lifestyle he allowed her to have. When it came to her daughter, however, there wouldn't be the same amount of love there, as Narcy and May remained pretty estranged, with them sometimes going for years without talking to one another. That didn't get any better once the newlyweds bought a new luxury home at 2501 Delmar Place, as, per the wishes of Ben, May would rarely be allowed to make visits there on the rare occasions she and her mother were in contact. The simple reason why he didn't want May around? It appears Ben never really liked the girl all that much. Maybe she never approved of his bad attitude, but she wouldn't be the only one who felt that way. By then, the convention king was beginning to get pushback from a number of clients he worked with on account of the way he would treat them while they were working together. At least one hotel would outright blackball him, and that led him to using his wife's connections to move over to the Hispanic market instead. That was something that allowed him to stay busy and spend a lot of money on his big interests: vintage Coca-Cola collectibles, antique cars, and of course, Batman memorabilia. Ben had become well known within the small community of Batman memorabilia collectors for the amount he would spend on his hobby. At one point, he turned part of his home into a museum so people could see all the rare pieces he had spent so much money on. While he was doing that, Narcy was spending plenty of money herself on things like expensive clothes. But even that wasn't enough to stop them fighting regularly, mostly on account of Ben's repeated womanizing despite his promises to not engage in any more affairs. Obviously, there were points where the situation looked grim for their marriage. At one time, Narcy came to believe Ben was going to divorce her. That was why, on June 9, 2002, she decided to make a statement and show that she would not be willing to let him leave her easily by staging a home invasion at their house on Delmar Drive. As to how that played itself out, well, it began in the early hours of that morning when, while the two were asleep in bed, 3 armed men broke in and immediately went for the man of the house. Luckily for him, though, he heard them coming and went for his gun. Unluckily for him, though, Narcy would give herself away by shouting out to the home invaders that Ben had a weapon. That gave them enough of a heads up to get to him before he grabbed it, and from there proceed to tie him to a chair and pistol whip him. As that was happening, Narcy was going through the house taking heirlooms, clothes, and business documents, as well as $437,000 in cash that was hidden in a safe. Once she was done with that, she returned to her husband and told him that the only reason he was getting out of this situation alive was because she was allowing it. As she said at the time, quote, "If I can't have you, no one will." And with that, she left with the 3 men, later calling a neighbor and telling them that Ben was tied up in the bedroom and in need of aid. But while it might have been expected that, once he was free, Ben would seek vengeance on his wife, he instead appeared quite meek about the whole situation, not wanting to cause any further problems. No, the only thing he wanted was for Narcy to bring his business records back as he needed them for work he had coming up. For her part, however, she held on to those documents for the time being, with her later explaining to police when she was brought in for questioning that she was using them as a form of leverage over her husband. The way she would explain it, Ben had been physically abusing her for years prior. Not only that, he'd also been very controlling over every aspect of her life, including deciding what breast enhancement surgery she was going to get. And when it came to the home invasion, well, she denied it had ever taken place. She claimed that Ben was into bondage games in the bedroom, and so, taking advantage of that, she'd convinced him to let her tie him up on June 9th so she would be able to go around the house freely taking things she believed were hers. That included private documents that showed that Ben was into some pretty out there stuff, such as amputee pornography, some of which involved very young girls. She argued that that was why he was so insistent about not causing too much of a scene and getting the documents back before things could escalate any further. He was scared the photos would be made public and cause irreparable damage to his reputation. They were wild accusations for sure, but one that was backed up by the fact that, as the days went on, Ben began expressing his desire for them to reconcile. Of course, how much of what Narcy was saying was true is still a matter of debate to this day. Detective Steve Palazzo, one of the men who interviewed her, certainly seemed to have doubts about large parts of her story. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be long before Narcy was back home and her and Ben were on good but uneasy terms once more. At least she assumed they were on good terms. In truth, however, Ben was still fearful over what she might do in the future, and now that he had his important documents back in his possession, he felt able to file for divorce, all while additionally filing an injunction to temporarily ban her from entering their home. In the end, though, the divorce would not go through, mostly because Narcy threatened to reveal information about offshore bank accounts Ben was keeping much of his money in if he continued to progress further with the matter. On top of that, there was also the idea of the sexual interests Ben didn't want leaking to the public. Whether it was true or not, she could leak the rumor without having to have physical evidence, and it would still be a blow to his reputation. Nobody else knew that was the reason Ben suddenly halted divorce proceedings, however. His friends and family were all baffled by the move, particularly his mother Bernice, who by that point was really beginning to question what kind of spell Narcy had over her son. But whether she liked it or not, Ben and Narcy seemed to be in it for the long haul once more. In fact, over the next few years, it really looked like they'd been able to move past the home invasion incident and get back on track with their marriage. Really, everything was on the up for the couple by the time 2006 came around and Ben turned 50. The reason for that was because by then, business would be booming more than ever at his Amway convention company, and the money he was bringing in was allowing him to continue spending millions on his ever-increasing Batman memorabilia collection. The marriage seemed so good that, upon turning 50, Ben wrote up a new will. The new one superseded their prior prenuptial agreement and stated that, should he die, his wife would get everything. There was one caveat to that, and it was that, if his mother was still alive when he died, Narcy would only get $200,000 and Bernice would get the rest. Of course, the chances that Bernice would outlive him seemed low, as by then she was well into her 80s. In the end, though, for as good as things seemed to be going, like before, it wasn't long before problems started presenting themselves between the couple. Problems that often centered around Narcy suspecting Ben had once more slipped back into his old adulterous ways. To be fair to her, though, she had good reason to believe that he was cheating on her again, that time with an escort named Rebecca Bliss, who he'd first found on a website named City Vibes. That has to be a pseudonym. It wouldn't be just a one-time thing either. No, quickly finding he liked Rebecca a lot, Ben continued buying her services over a series of weeks and months. That would all eventually lead up to a point where, in June of 2008, he moved the call girl over to an apartment in Fort Lauderdale that he was paying for so that they could be closer to one another. And that wasn't all he was paying for by then when it came to Rebecca. Ben was making sure to give her a life of luxury in other ways too by purchasing her $10,000 worth of music equipment so she could follow her dreams of becoming a DJ. Clearly, he had fallen head over heels for her by then. It seemed that he was so sure that he wanted to be with Rebecca that, when Narcy confronted him about his repeated infidelities, he admitted it outright and told his wife he wanted a divorce again. Meanwhile, more bad news was occurring for Narcy because Bernice, now an old woman, had decided to redraft her own will. In it was stated that any money she had inherited from her deceased husband would not go to her son or, in the event of his death, his wife. Instead, it would go to a local Jewish federation set up to support that community. Fortunately for Narcy, however, Bernice would never actually complete that will. Rather, for one reason or another, it would sit in her office unfinished, perhaps because she assumed she had more time to go back and finalize it at a later date. How little she knew then, because by that point, both Bernice and Ben's time was drawing to a very fast close. But before Narcy would resort to murdering her husband over his attempts to divorce her and take away her lavish lifestyle, she first tried to get revenge on him by going to the police and claiming she had knowledge of numerous crimes he was involved in. Immigration fraud, tax evasion, heavy drug use. She laid it all out to Special Agent John Wiley of the Miami Palm Beach branch of the FBI when she visited there soon after. Ultimately, her claims weren't deemed to be credible as she simply didn't have the physical evidence to back them up. So when that plan failed, she tried going to Rebecca directly and offering her $10,000 to leave her husband alone, something which also bore no fruit. It was that second failure that pushed her to make her final decision. As 10 years had passed since they were married, as per the terms of her and Ben's prenuptial agreement, should they divorce, Narcy would only be entitled to $65,000 of her husband's fortune, a fortune that was now valued at $7.2 million. Clearly, that simply wouldn't be enough to keep her in the manner of living she'd become accustomed to. She was sure that drastic action was going to have to be taken to ensure the divorce didn't happen, and that's what led to Narcy calling her brother, Cristobal Veliz, and formulating a plan with him. That plan would see both Ben and Bernice be killed so that any money they had would be inherited by Narcy. Before any plans could be executed, however, reliable help would first have to be brought on board. So Cristobal recruited Melvin Medrano, an employee at a local car wash, to assist them in taking out their first target, Bernice. Once Melvin arrived at Bernice's home with instructions to kill her, though, a neighbor would catch him lingering around the property. That was enough to scare him off for good. Too spooked to carry out the act himself, He suggested to Cristobal that a young illegal immigrant named Alejandro Garcia would be the best person for the job instead, as he was desperate for work and more inclined to go along with the job despite the risks involved. Of course, all the while that was happening, Cristobal would be in constant contact with his sister, giving her regular updates on what was going on because, after all, she was the real ringleader behind the plan. That would mean she'd hear all about the events of Friday, April 3rd, 2009, the second attempt at taking out Bernice. Unfortunately for the would-be killers, that attempt would also end in failure, as after arriving at her property at 1 o'clock that afternoon, Cristobal and Alejandro would find that no one was home. So, instead they were forced to leave and come back the next evening around 9:20 p.m. when they were informed by Narcy that Bernice was going to be coming back from an evening out. With that key information, the assailants hid in the shrubbery outside, wrenches in hand, watching as the woman pulled up into her garage. The men used the moment between Bernice getting out of her car and her garage door closing by running up and attacking her. Alejandro specifically beat her across the face numerous times with his wrench in an act which almost certainly led to her death. And after that was over, assuming the woman was dead, they cleaned up any fingerprints they might have left behind during the scuffle and took her key ring as evidence that the job had been done. Then they drove off into the night, convinced their work had been completed. But it hadn't. No, despite the assault she'd been a victim of, Bernice was still alive, albeit barely. That meant she had enough energy to crawl into her kitchen and, before collapsing, have the wherewithal to close her garage door electronically so that no one else could get back in to finish the job. At that point, though, the injuries she'd suffered were simply too much for the 87-year-old to endure any further. She soon slipped into unconsciousness there on her kitchen floor and eventually passed away. The next morning, it was a neighbor who had first raised the alarm bells that something was wrong. Upon realizing Bernice hadn't shown her face around the neighborhood as she usually did, they tried her door. When there was no answer there, the neighbor felt the best thing to do was to call her son Ben to arrange a wellness check. Once Ben arrived not long after and entered the property, what he found would be nothing less than a murder scene as Bernice was laying face down in a pool of her own blood in the kitchen. Narcy, who was waiting outside in the car, pretended to be shocked when she heard. Looking back at the scene, it seemed like it would have been clear that the woman had been attacked, but rather than see it for what it clearly was, a murder, they instead initially wrote it off as an old lady having a fall while at home. That ended up leading to her cause of death being determined to have been accidental. Of course, it might seem far-fetched to have been an accident given the fact that her jaw was broken and her skull was cracked, but that wasn't the first time Bernice had taken a bad spill in recent history. Only weeks prior to her death, she injured herself outside of a bank in the same manner, so there was some plausibility to such an explanation. The way the investigation team saw it, after exiting her car, Bernice had tripped and hurt herself. And while she then had enough energy to make her way inside, the head injury she'd suffered was obviously too much for her to bear. It didn't matter if Ben thought there was too much blood at the scene for that to be the case, or if at least one doctor conducting the autopsy disagreed with the idea it was an accidental death. In the end, that's the way the official ruling would go. Authorities wouldn't get much opportunity to reassess the cause of Bernice's death because, as per the arrangements of Narcy, her body would be cremated pretty quickly. That meant that no further autopsies could be done. All that was going to happen was Ben was going to inherit his mother's $2 million fortune, and that meant he'd have even more money to leave to his wife should anything tragic, coincidentally, befall him in the near future. And of course, it was going to. Narcy and Cristobal immediately set upon figuring out exactly how they were going to do that following the funeral of Bernice. Not that they could tell Alejandro Garcia their plans, however, because after learning that Bernice had succumbed to the injuries he'd inflicted upon her, he became distraught all of a sudden. It seemed that he was never told that the plan was to actually kill Bernice, just to rough her up a little. So at that point, Narcy and Cristobal knew if they wanted to keep him on board for the next step of their plan, they were going to have to convince him that what was about to befall Ben was only going to be a case of roughing up too. They were able to argue that they were just as shocked as anyone that Bernice had died and that the plan was merely to incapacitate and disable Ben so Narcy could run his company in his stead. Sure, it might seem wild that Alejandro would believe that, but once the ringleaders sold him a story of Ben being a pedophile, he seemed to be all in once more. From there, moves were made to have the murder take place at an upcoming Amway convention Ben was about to hold at a Hilton hotel in New York. That time, though, understanding that her husband was a lot more physically capable than her mother-in-law had been, Narcy realized she was going to have to bring a fourth and fifth person on board, with them being a 26-year-old named Joel Gonzalez who was recommended by Alejandro specifically, and Dennis Ramirez, Cristobal's son-in-law. Murder, it's a family affair. Once those two were brought up to speed, the plan would kick into gear on July 9th, 2009. That was the day Ben and Narcy arrived at the New York Hilton in order to start taking charge over the week-long convention he booked there. Meanwhile, she kept in regular contact with her brother as he, Alejandro, Joel, and Dennis all traveled up from Fort Lauderdale in a Lincoln town car Cristobal had procured specifically for the job. It was a vehicle that was not registered under his name and so couldn't be traced back to him. Of course, that wouldn't be the only car they'd use over the course of the weekend, though. In order to further throw any future investigators off the scent, the plan was for them to dump the Lincoln once the murder was complete and escape in a Nissan Pathfinder driven by Dennis, their designated getaway driver. Needless to say then, that meant he would not be present when the actual attack took place. Rather, he'd be waiting outside the Hilton with Cristobal as Alejandro and Joel were sent inside to do the actual dirty work. And that's exactly what they did. At 6:45 a.m. on the morning of July 12th, the day the convention was ending, Narcy called her brother to let him know that Ben had just gone to bed and so was vulnerable and prone for them to strike. They headed upstairs to the Woodlands suite the couple was staying in, trying their best not to be seen but getting caught on multiple security cameras regardless. When they finally arrived at the room, Narcy was waiting in the hallway to invite them in, and from there they proceeded to take the dumbbells, duct tape, and gloves out of the bag they'd brought with them and headed into the bedroom where Ben was sleeping. What followed was a short but violent affair, one that saw Ben manage to break the arm of Joel's sunglasses during a brief struggle as he tried to hold him down while Alejandro beat him bloody with a dumbbell. It was a severe and brutal beating, but that wasn't the worst part of what took place that morning. After handing down a deadly onslaught on Ben's body, Alejandro went to the kitchen to get a knife and from there proceeded to gouge both of Ben's eyes out of his skull as he barely clung to life. At that point, there was no surviving the situation for Ben, and that's why it was almost a mercy when he was put out of his misery once his killers taped his mouth shut with duct tape and watched as he choked on his own vomit. After that was over, they did their best to clear away any sign that they'd ever been in the room, though crucially they would forget to pick up the broken off arm of Joel's sunglasses, something that would come back to bite them down the line. For the time being, though, that was not something that concerned them. No, all they were concerned with was getting out of the hotel. Both Alejandro and Joel made sharp exits, heading out to the street where they were picked up by Cristobal and Dennis. All the while, back inside, Narcy headed down to the hotel lobby in order to try and give herself an alibi for where she was when her husband was presumably upstairs dying. A half hour or so after that, she returned to her room and, pretending she'd just discovered Ben's body, immediately screamed out for help. And that's when hotel security discovered what had happened and called the authorities. They arrived later that morning and found an incredibly bloody scene waiting for them, one which had clearly involved a murder given the damage that had been done to Ben's skull and the fact that his mouth had been taped shut. But while there was no reason to suspect Narcy was involved of any of that at first, upon questioning her it became apparent she knew more than she was letting on. Sure, her story of going down to breakfast early and then coming up to find her husband dead seemed plausible enough. When the investigators on the scene asked her about the sunglasses arm they found on the bed, and she tried to brush it off by saying it was hers and that Ben was trying to fix them for her, something didn't add up. After all, how could he be fixing them if the rest of the sunglasses weren't there but were, as Narcy now claimed, lost at a prior time? And why was she working so hard to push the idea that her husband had multiple enemies who might want him dead? The story she was feeding them just didn't feel right, and the suspicion on her was only added to when her daughter May gave a conflicting report. The young woman, who was there at the hotel with her mother that weekend, said Narcy had gone downstairs earlier that morning. On top of that, security at the hotel would confirm no keycards had been used to access the room at the point the murder would have happened, so that meant someone would have had to let the attackers into the room from the inside. Then there was the incident from 7 years prior, the one involving a staged home invasion at 2501 Delmar Drive. Once the police investigation unearthed that incident upon looking into Ben's life further, there was even more reason to be wary of Narcy. But when that incident was brought up to her, she denied that it had ever happened. When it came to the guests at the hotel who had allegedly seen her letting 2 men into her room not long before Ben died, well, she also denied that was true. Obviously then, someone was lying, and this was why police asked Narcy to take a lie detector test, something she agreed to. Unfortunately for her, though, she failed the test on multiple occasions. That, combined with all of the other evidence against her, was enough for investigators to place her under surveillance. After only a few days, she withdrew $100,000 from Ben's bank account, which only drew further suspicion. That would grow into outright belief that she was responsible when May came forward to say she believed her stepfather had been killed, and that her mother had planned it. She wasn't the only member of Narcy's family who felt she did it, though. Not long after that, an anonymous letter later revealed to have been written by her sister Letitia Taruno would also accuse her of having been the one who committed the crime. Why did her sister believe that? Well, as both May and Letitia would say, it was all to do with money, namely the money Narcy stood to lose should Ben follow through with his threat of divorcing her. Obviously then, with that accusation came a renewed interest into what had actually happened to Bernice. After all, the fact that she'd died as a result of similar blunt force trauma to the head just a couple of months prior seemed even more suspicious in hindsight with this new information taken into account. Bernice's sister Maxine began pushing for her case to be reopened, something she was eventually able to do. As she was doing that, the story of what had happened to the wealthy son and mother quickly spread throughout the media as the public sentiment became very negative towards Narcy. But then why wouldn't it? Because based on the evidence that had been released to them, it seemed pretty likely she was the one responsible for the murders. That general opinion was only solidified further when she began making attempts to take over her husband's estate in order to get access to all of his assets. Sure, under the terms of Ben's will, she was legally entitled to it, but it did add to the feeling that what authorities were dealing with was a crime committed over money. The police were evidently leaning towards that explanation too, as in the days following, they began investigating Narcy more aggressively, which soon led them to the doorstep of her brother Cristobal. Clearly, though, he was not going to give either himself or his sister up. No, instead he tried to point to his niece May as being the one who had committed the crime, presumably because she hadn't gotten along with her stepfather while he was alive. Of course, it made little sense that May would be the one responsible, though, and that would only lead to the authorities looking deeper into Cristobal and his list of known associates, one of whom was Alejandro Garcia. When they finally caught up with him, everything started to fall into place as his appearance was a complete match for one of the men who had been seen lingering around the hallways of the New York Hilton on CCTV footage during the minutes leading up to Ben's death. By then, it was becoming clearer and clearer that some nefarious plot had been carried out. So while Ben's funeral was occurring on September 2nd, 2009, a funeral that was not paid for by his wife, but instead by his childhood friend Kelsey Grammer, Plans were being made to formally depose Narcy and force her to answer further questions about her potential involvement in her husband's murder. Unsurprisingly then, when she was brought in and questioned about it soon after, she pleaded the fifth whenever she didn't have a suitable lie to offer. But even if she wasn't willing to admit what she had done, it didn't matter much anymore, as phone records showed conversations taking place between Cristobal and Alejandro where they had talked about their plans in detail, including how Narcy was running the show from a distance. That all led to July 8, 2010, the day Narcy was formally arrested. In accordance with all the evidence that had been built up about the people involved in the crime based on phone calls and information Alejandro offered in exchange for leniency, Cristobal, Joel, and Dennis were also brought in. Realizing the jig was up, Joel would immediately flip and offer to tell everything he knew in exchange for a lighter sentence. That gave the authorities all of the evidence they needed to start bringing the case to trial. Still, though, it would take a while before the trial would actually begin. But when it did 2 years later, the prosecution felt pretty confident they were going to get guilty verdicts on all of the 11 counts they were charging the defendants with. Their confidence would prove to be warranted because after a trial that saw witnesses like Rebecca Bliss, Alejandro, and Joel paint a damning picture of the kind of people Narcy and Cristobal were, the jury found it easy to convict all 5 people who had been responsible, with Narcy and Cristobal receiving the brunt of the blame as they were found to be guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, domestic violence, stalking, money laundering, and witness tampering. One thing they would not be found guilty of, though, was violent crime in aid of racketeering, and that meant the death penalty would not be on the table. At sentencing, the judge gave both Narcy Novack and Cristobal Veliz life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for the other 3 men involved, 2 of whom had actually committed the murder but who had also been cooperating with investigators, and 1 of whom had been the getaway driver, well, they all got lesser sentences. Dennis Ramirez got time served for his relatively minor role. Alejandro Garcia got 17.5 years for being the primary figure who did the deed in each murder, and Joel Gonzalez got 10 years for the part he played in the killing. Narcy and her brother Cristobal are where they will remain for the rest of their natural lives. Narcy is also not enjoying any of the benefits of being rich behind bars either because, in accordance with the Slayer rule, she's been deemed ineligible to inherit any of her husband's estate. As it stands today, that estate, one that is now valued at $4.2 million, has gone to May Abad and her 2 sons, meaning that now that money can be put to use by someone who isn't a cold-blooded monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.